I just would like to invite Sarah. You're going to pick up some questions, and Jess or Jen, or just maybe send them to the end of your rows, and then you bring them up. Thank you, Sarah and Jess, two of our graduate students who are helping out tonight. Thanks. Ruth, you talk about partnering with the right people. What type of interaction do you think social enterprise groups like Acumen Fund should have with aid organizations? Do you want to explain a little bit about the question, a social enterprise group?
This is a tricky issue. I am in general, picking up on some of what we already discussed, I'm in general in favor of seeing both the American government, I know that's not the question, but let me just say this, and some of the large international non-governmental organizations that we were talking about, trying different approaches. I mean, I talked very passionately about our approach. We have reasons for pursuing that. We think it works, and we think it's very reflective of Jewish values, but I don't necessarily think it's the only thing. Dan mentioned Jeff Sachs. He's trying something different than he tried before, but it's not nearly as grassroots as what I'm doing, and it would be great if it worked, because under his theory, for about $500,000 a village, you can make change. It's not my approach, but I've sort of told him, like, you know, if you could make it work, it would be, anyway. So similarly, I want to say that a lot of the different not-for-profit efforts that are springing up, I want to see a lot of different approaches proceed. Sometimes people seem to me to be specifically doing harm, both because they have a religious or political agenda, and sometimes because they just don't know what they're doing. In Haiti, 2 months after the earthquake, the UN estimated that there were 10,000 non-governmental groups working in Haiti. Most of them had never been there before. Some of them, as you know, one of them was arrested for taking children for adoption by taking them off the street. Anyway, so there's lots of bad work being done. Now, that said, what the question is about is a movement in which people describe themselves as social entrepreneurs. The Acumen Fund is one such example. In which they're raising private money in this country, as do we, and looking for ways to spend and invest it, and then they vary. Sometimes they're looking for ways to spend and invest it where they will get a return. So spend, for example, an issue which I believe the Acumen Fund, I think, don't quote me on this, tried, but which wasn't successful, but which we would all love to see, is how do you make a cheap hearing aid? Okay, this seems to be something the world has not been able to do yet. In this country, it has different impact because there's medical insurance and there's Medicaid. In the rest of the world, if you can't hear, you can't hear, because you're never going to be able to afford a working hearing aid. So obviously, if there are people willing to put up a lot of money to experiment with making a very low-cost hearing aid, or another example that I actually like, you know those playground merry-go-rounds where the kids run and the thing goes round and round, where there are places in the world where that's being hooked up to wells. So when the kids play, water comes up. Now that strikes me as like just more fun than you could imagine, and it's actually a great connection. So people who are investing in sort of enterprise things like that and then want some return on their money because they want, it's actually related to your question about scalability. If merry-go-rounds like that could actually provide accessible water in 100,000 places where right now people are walking miles every day, then that's something worth investing in, and you understand that people want some return on it. My concern about some examples of so-called social entrepreneurship is that it is people who say, we actually know exactly what they need there, and we're going to go do it, and we're going to get a little bit return on our money, and they never talk to local people. So there's a really good book about the Acumen Fund, which somebody will tell me the name of. It's got Blue Sweater in the title. Blue Sweater, that's what it's called. And it actually is, thank you, Sarah Jane, it's actually a wonderful book, and it's partly wonderful because she talks about her progress on precisely this issue, about initially going to countries and thinking that she knew exactly what she and her investors ought to do, and then constantly learning and relearning how much wisdom and knowledge resided in the local community.
Well, if nothing else, I figured out tonight how to make a profit for my hyperactive 4-year-old who would be great on one of those little things. So I should put one of those in our backyard for our energy use. This next question is about a particular book. If familiar with it, we can hear your response. If not, we can move on. What is your opinion of the book White Man's Burden, Why the West's AIDS Have Done So Much Ill and So Little Good? Is that a book
I
too?
love it. It's William Easterly's book about aid, and it actually, I think it fairly, I haven't read it in about 8 years, but I think it makes the point that we were mutually making, which is that, from different perspectives, but is that too much United States aid is done by planners who sit someplace and plan, and it would be better if more of it was done by seekers who go someplace and try to look for the answers. So I was very taken with it when I read it. I think it's a good book, and it's more recognized. The same point I just made about some of the social entrepreneurship efforts. It more recognizes that there's local wisdom. I mean, I'd like to just sort of make sure everybody has like local examples. So you don't have to go to Africa to realize that we are regularly substituting the wise judgment and wisdom of people who know less well. The United States government spent a lot of time in the couple of months after Katrina, literally scratching their heads as to why the people in the Ninth Ward didn't leave. They didn't leave, folks, because they didn't have cars. There's a massive neighborhood, poor neighborhood in New Orleans where people didn't have cars, and here was a government which frankly knew that the levees weren't high enough, knew that there was going to be some risk of a flood at some point, and just imagine that their scheme, which was evacuate, would, on a moment's notice, be carried out. You cannot evacuate if you don't have access to a vehicle. And so that's just like not sort of listening. If the effort had been, and I would say still is now, since we're not rebuilding the levees high enough, to talk to all of the people in New Orleans, not just the mayor, nice as he may be, not just the elected officials, but the people in community groups about what will we do the next time we have a disaster of this magnitude, you would find a lot of local wisdom and thought that you could build into your planning.
Dan, do you have any thoughts about that book or any response?
Oh yeah, that was a famous book, and we actually have brought out a lot of the points that that book makes. When the book first came out, it was not very popular with the community of people who are in this business, but it has been accepted as saying something very useful. And we can all give examples. I could give you some examples of some projects that were well-meaning and that didn't ask local people what they wanted, and that therefore didn't work. So there is another side to that, and that is that if you ask, and this is not just in Africa, this is everywhere, who do you ask locally? Because there are local interests too, and there are divisions. Even among faculty in a particular department at the University of Washington, there are sometimes some divisions. But when you go into a village or a town or some part of New Orleans or some part of Seattle or anywhere, there are different interests, and you ask, and people will often tell you things that might benefit their group, but then antagonize another group. So it becomes very delicate. In the mid-'60s, when I was in Niger, after working for adult literacy, I worked for the Department of Agriculture doing research for them. And I remember one of the projects that I was involved with, I had to get a rough outline of what lands were being cultivated by people in this village and in the people in that village and the people in that village. And I went around on horseback with people from village A, and sort of marking down what they told me. Oh yeah, well, people from this village cultivate up to that tree, and up to that boulder, and so on. Then I went to village B, and I was riding around with them, and we came to the same area, and they said, well, we cultivate up to that area. And like an idiot, because I was very young, I said, oh, that's funny, because this was in Hausa, which I had to learn. People didn't speak French in the villages there. I said, that's funny, because the people here in that village told me that they have up to here. Well, the people I was riding with, they just turned their horses around and galloped back to the center of the village. And I followed them. and they called the village chief who came out, and I saw riders taking off to village A, and people told me to just wait, and after a while, a group of people came on horseback. Niger is a very dry country, and there are a lot of horses. Horses do well there. They came back with the very elderly village chief from village A riding. He was over 80, so they were helping him. And he got off, and he started yelling. The two village chiefs started yelling at each other. And my house, it was okay, but it wasn't perfect. But I heard the chief from village A cackling, and he said, "Ha, it's too late. The white man's written it down." And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? Because this is a country which a few years before, this was 1965, and in 1960 it had become independent after having been a French colony. So out in villages, people weren't quite sure of what independence meant. And no matter how young I was, they just assumed I was a French official. And I tried to intercede and say, no, what I wrote down doesn't matter. But I mean, it's a good lesson because you should ask local people, but of course, everyone here knows this. How do you tell, and how do you not get involved in some local fight, which can produce deadly results in some cases?
First of all, these questions are amazing, and there's so many of them, we're not going to be able to get to them, but I will be sure, we'll post them online and we'll share them, and maybe even we could try to keep responding to them electronically in the next few weeks. This question asks, with the uprising of the Arab Spring continuing, including in North Africa, can you address if movements for democracy can influence the effectiveness of aid efforts in sub-Saharan Africa? Influence the...
It's a complex question, and we don't work at all in North Africa and the Middle East, so I can't really speak to that. But in general, yeah, I think the more empowered people feel, and the more that they are working on developing their own vision and getting some hearing for that, the better the aid efforts are likely to be. This again goes to this question of scalability, because I think we've really been clear in that, even after all of you contribute your entire wealth, American Jewish World Service is not going to be big enough to do all this work alone, as Dan said. And the question is, the reason I'm for expanding our foreign aid budget is because I have the undying optimism that America can keep doing it better, not just doing it in response to multinational agribusinesses, not just doing it. So one of the things that will make American aid better is if they're more informed. Your last example was hilarious, but more informed branches of civil society actually engaged in an active argument with American aid officials about what kinds of aid will make the most difference. When we'll leave the names of the countries out of here, but various countries in the last decade where we toppled a leader and announced that democracy would now arrive, one of the many problems was that those countries had zero experience with building civil society. So they were like the villagers in Niger. They didn't really know what it meant that they were now democratic, and they had no notion of how to move toward that. So I would think that the more the people really sort of informing themselves and trying to create their own local visions of change, the more that American aid will have to be responsive to that, and the better it will be.
Yeah. Leaving aside questions of the Arab Spring, which is a little bit out of beyond the boundaries of what we're discussing today, generally the whole issue of democracy is a very interesting one, because certainly the United States has placed too much faith in, well, democracy always works. It doesn't always work here. But anyway, we've noticed. And Americans do tend to forget about our own history, that we did have a really big civil war because the election of 1860 turned out not to solve any problems at all. And it's a good idea to remember that, because after the collapse of communism in 89 to 91, there was this wave, not just the United States, but the West Europeans as well, sort of pushed democracy everywhere. And in very deeply divided societies, just having a vote can actually start a civil war rather than solving anything. And it did happen to us. Well, I wasn't here in 1860, I'm not that old, but it did happen to the United States. And we forget that. So this is not to say anything against democracy or against the Arab Spring or anything else like that. But it's another example of why it's necessary to be cautious, and we don't always know better. And there isn't a formula that fits every case all the time. So pushing for elections right away may not always be a good idea. And you really do have to know what's going on in a society. In Kenya, they have an election coming up, and people there are scared because the last election, they were officially 1,100 people killed, and it may have been more than that, but it was pretty bloody in some areas. And none of those tensions have been resolved. So they're going to have an election, and they should have an election, but how is it going to work out? We don't know. And so it's a very difficult question.
One of the buzzwords in NGO international development is a partnership. But this seems to mean the local partner agrees to implement the program dictated by the donor. This is not really partnership, but rather franchising. What is AJWS's definition and approach to partnership with local NGOs?
We literally don't have any scheme of how we want our money to be used. Now, obviously, we pick which projects to make partners. So if a project had a vision of how they thought they were going to make change and it made no sense to us, it's not likely to be a project that we would continue negotiations with. But we're very intent about the use of the word partner, because we are partners with those organizations in that we invest an average of $40,000 a year in the work that they have determined that they want to do. And so I'm not quite sure I can follow the franchise. I know what you meant, but the analogy, but we are really their partners as much as they are our partners. We are making an investment in their vision of change. Now, as I said, we get to pick it, and regionally we have areas that in the regions in which we work, we have some places we're working particularly on sustainable agriculture. Some places we're working significantly and dramatically on LGBTI rights. Some places we're working more particularly on sort of the full range of empowerment for adolescent girls. So we're looking for projects in those regions that do that work. But we're quite open to somebody saying, we think this is an important way to do it. We think this is an important way to do it. And we really, we are, I think, reasonably aware of the power dynamic of being the guys with the money, but we are really sensitive to what the partner organization sees as its priorities. And I've told donors that I would not take money, I don't like doing this, but I would not take money for their vision of what should happen in the community that they visited with us, because it would be insulting to our partner organization to be suddenly told, even though what you're working on is holistic community development, we have somebody who's just determined to build and staff a clinic. And the person who wanted to do that, I said to him finally, look, if there were severe health problems in that community, I might be willing to negotiate on your behalf. But what you're talking about as sick children is a bunch of kids with upper respiratory infections whose noses are going to drip for the rest of their lives, and it won't kill them. It would be better if the community was allowed to rebuild the way it wants to.
Dan, have you seen, in your own experience, this kind of handcuffs that foreign organizations can put on, aid organizations can put on local organizations at all? Is that something that happens?
It happens all the time. And there are different pressures. So to take an organization like CARE, there's often actually disagreement. I should say, I've never been an employee of CARE. I just did consulting work for them. So, and a consultant is someone who, if the advice given is good, someone in the organization takes credit for it. And if the advice turns out badly, it's blamed on the consultant. So, but anyway, I guess people in the organization would admit this. There's even tension between the main office, which is in Atlanta, Georgia, and the field offices. but they're commands that come from the main office that say you've got to make sure that, for example, you push gender equality. Well, there's nothing wrong with gender equality, and particularly in a lot of African situations, the way in which women are exploited is actually very detrimental to economic development there. It's extremely wasteful and also very unfair. But nevertheless, there's some situations where if you start pushing that too much, all you'll do is just alienate the community. And yet orders do come down and conditions are set. But usually the good field people know how to get around that and tend to be more flexible than the people in the central office. And if I thought that this was a problem with an organization like CARE, it's much more of a problem with USAID. Even though now USAID does most of its work by contracting out. So yeah, it's an issue, but people who have worked in the field for many years tend to be quite admirable people. First of all, to be able to survive, I mean, not just physically, that's not so difficult, but psychologically in some of these situations for year after year, which some people have done, requires a certain mental fortitude. And the people who have done this have learned a lot, and they tend to be quite flexible and much better. So yeah, these are problems that come up.
So yeah, that points to sort of a tension between our own, not only what we want to do, but our own values. You talk about human rights or gender equality, and those are things that are probably important for donors in this country, but different cultures have different assumptions about some of those standards. So I can imagine that creates a tension. And here's a question that I think touches on that, which is, what are your thoughts about withholding aid to pressure nations to protect human rights? For example, Uganda's anti-homosexuality bill. How much pressure should be linked to this aid, especially given sort of cultural differences between different countries, or West and Africa?
Well, I think it's a really important question. It's really complicated. It's legitimate for funders, from our size funders to the United States government to the French government, to have conditions that they want to see met. Dan's example of the CARE field offices was great, because if you set a condition that's only going to cause a backfiring, so you're not going to get the change you want, you haven't gained anything. But I do think it's legitimate to have conditions. So speaking to that specific question, here's the issue. We're about to go through the third round of the legislature in Uganda introducing a bill which provides the death penalty for aggravated homosexuality, and requires that anyone who fails to identify a homosexual, and the bill is specific that this includes doctors, teachers, parents, children, and neighbors, is liable to be put in jail for 3 years for not identifying. Anyway, so it's a pretty crazy piece of legislation. So the first thing I have to tell you, which will really make you all feel great for the evening, is that this piece of legislation was introduced to evangelical legislators in Uganda by evangelical priests from this country, preachers from this country. Specifically Rick Warren from the Saddleback Church, who took a small group of people on a tour of Africa to tell them how they should organize against homosexuality. And by the way, in addition to their claim, I'm sorry, I don't want to be insulting. In addition to their religious belief that, based on the Bible, that homosexuality is a sin, the argument they use in African countries is an argument that equates homosexuality with pedophilia, which for sure the Bible does not do. So they don't just say this is what the Bible says about against homosexual behavior. They say that homosexuals are after your children. And one of the reasons that they have had such traction is these are societies that hugely value their children. And so they're scared. When the bill was first introduced, given cell phones, the web, and whatever, those words spread very quickly around the world. And we were honored to actually get called by some American gay rights organizations saying, okay, we're a gay rights organization. You work in Africa, you probably know a little bit more about this than we do, but we're mobilizing tomorrow to go to the Ugandan embassy, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to be really clear, it sounded great to me. I'm a fighter on this issue my entire life. And I was like ready to mobilize to help these groups, and I was smart enough to ask my field people, who then talked to people on the ground in Uganda, our partner organizations, who came back running, essentially went out and said, please tell those groups not to do this. That anything that they take the form of like picketing the Ugandan embassy in Washington is just going to make them angrier. Well, we said, well, okay, so I learned very fast that I was on the wrong track. What would make a difference? And they said, our grassroots groups in a coalition that are going to give us money to have put together very quickly, so a coalition of all of the LGBTI groups that were fighting the legislation. And these are groups that are doing this work, obviously, at great risk, and some of them have been living. The answer from them was, please don't demonstrate in front of the Ugandan embassy. Tell your government to put pressure on our government. And actually, that's what we did. We got Judas Kagwa, who was the head of this coalition, to Washington Place, met with the president and with members of our Congress. I was in Uganda in the middle of this, and when the Ugandan press, which is not a terrible press, asked Museveni, what's happening with the bill? And he said publicly, all I will tell you is I'm trying to get help for my country, and every conversation I've had this week with Stephen Harper, Gordon Brown, and Hillary Clinton is about this legislation. That's phenomenal. I don't know what they were threatening, but whatever they were doing was a good job. So I'm in favor of tough sanctions at some point. Well, why should, and it's particularly galling that this would actually be used by America.
Well, there's
Rick Warren says that this is not true. That he made this tour, but he never had any intention of legislation like this resulting.
well, maybe we'll have a report for our next conversation about this. Maybe in fact, a little bit more tension between our speakers. But we are at our time to end the conversation, and I just want to thank you both so much for letting us your living room or and sharing the space with us. Once again,
one quiz question before you end.
yeah.
No one had these great questions. I hope you all looked at the quizzes before they'll run again. Try to answer some questions about Africa. So here's the question. You have 3 yeses. Don't answer it. No. Which country in the world has the highest percentage of women in elected office? Somebody said. Not country. Not Botswana. But you're all right on the right continent. That's good. In the back. Yes, it's Rwanda. 56% of the elected officials.
Interesting. Well, I think that question, like all the other 2 questions, for those who saw the quiz questions the first day, it seemed very simple. What are two democracies in Africa? And there were a number of great answers very quickly, and then Dan, wrote this really interesting analysis of all these answers. It turned out many of them were sort of correct, correct this way, not correct in that way. You go to our Facebook page and see. But what I think that was a great start to the conversation with the ending is that this is a very complex situation. The countries that we might not expect to look a certain way, may look a certain way. The notions of aid that we think are helping others may not really be helping others. And at the same time, what I'm leaving tonight with, in addition to a tremendous appreciation for your knowledge and your work in the world, is an appreciation for the complexity, but also, I think, the hope that even if the big changes may not be simple and will take a long time, that there are lots of smaller steps, incremental steps that seem to be making an impact. Let me just thank again the Legacy Heritage Foundation for sponsoring these talks. Our assistant director, Jennifer Cohen, has been tremendous in putting this together, so we need to thank her. Thank you to each and every one staff for helping getting Ruth here. JConnect and UW Hill has also partnered with us in various ways, so thank you all. What I want to tell you is that if you like tonight, in only actually
actually, it's about 6 weeks away on January 24th. We will have the second in our conversations, which is going to be about what does it mean to create a just American politics. And we are going to have Simon Greer, who is the president of the Jewish Fund for Justice, and David Donkey, who is a professor of communication at the University of Washington, and writes about religion in American politics. And they are going to be a few days after the start of the primary season, in a moment of very interesting politics, to talk about what's the role, the Jewish role in American politics, and how has that changed over time. So I hope to see you all there. And let me just end once again by thanking our guests and saying one of the greatest things for me about putting this series together, which was sort of unexpected, is that I've had the chance to meet with some truly amazing people who I haven't met before, or some who I have met, or just have been able to put people together and talk to the whole thing. So thank you for sharing tonight. Thank you all for being here. I look forward to seeing you on the platform.